Today we're going to look at a couple Cisco routers, one from 1998 and one from 2009, that both have the same affliction. They can't boot into an operating system to do anything useful. Instead, upon power up, they just drop into something called ROM or ROM monitor. I'll go over how to get a version of iOS, the operating system these things used, back on the machines and get them running again. We'll use something called a TFTP server to do this, which I'm hosting in what I'm calling the retro rack. So I'm going to use this as an excuse to do some housekeeping in there. I made a pretty critical error in my original rack configuration. I can't fit my hand all the way behind one of my patch panels, rendering most of the wires on the front useless. So we'll get a 2U patch panel in there, rearrange some things, and finally see if we can save these routers. Let's get into it. Today, I want to do a little housekeeping down here. I've got two of these Cisco routers I picked up over the past few months, and they both have the same problem. They don't have a copy of iOS on them. iOS is the operating system Cisco gear runs that actually lets you use the thing for its intended purpose, configure the interfaces, and actually set up networks. When you boot these up, you don't get iOS, you get the dreaded ROM. ROM, short for ROM monitor, is basically the firmware of these routers. It's baked in from the factory, and assuming there isn't some sort of catastrophic hardware problem, you'll always be able to get into it. I say dreaded because the device drops into ROM if you have a corrupt version of iOS, you've plugged in a broken interface adapter, basically whenever something bad has happened. But I want to see if I can get these things working today, so we'll go over how to get iOS back onto a machine that is stuck in ROM. On the top, we've got a little Cisco 2600 series router. This one is a 2620. And I've actually got its little brother. This is a 2610. And best I can tell, there is one critical difference between the two. They both come with a built-in Ethernet interface, but this one on the top, this is the 2610, it just says Ethernet 00. So that means that's 10 megabit per second Ethernet. But the 2620 down here says 10100 Ethernet 00. Meaning it can do 10 megabit, just like this one, and also what's called fast Ethernet, 100 megabits per second. That might sound wild, but the 2600 line came out all the way back in 1998, and fast Ethernet, or 100 megabit per second Ethernet, wasn't necessarily a guarantee back then. I got this from a viewer named Victor, so a huge thanks to him, and we'll try to tackle this one first and get it working. It'd be nice to have a 2600 with fast Ethernet in the lineup. I've also got this much newer 2900 series. This is a 2951. I picked this up from a viewer named Josh for, I want to say, 20 bucks. I was actually at his place buying a Sun Microsystems server rack. I have no idea what I'm going to do with that thing yet, so it's in pieces all over the basement in the garage. The wife loves it. This one has essentially the same issue. No version of iOS on it, but there are several different options for where you can actually store iOS, so we'll tackle this one second. Let's get a closer look at the 2600. Suppose we can start off by giving it a little bath here. It's been in Victor's garage, I suspect, and then it's been in my garage for months. Yeah, look at that. That is looking way better. These routers are modular. These 2600s, at least this one, has 2 slots. We'll take a look at those. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Cisco always had this, fill these slots with modularity, the Modularity Cafe. We'll go look at the archived version of that website when we're trying to get this thing working again. This thing came populated with 2 wicks. We've got a serial and a T1 DSU CSU card for T1 interconnectivity. You basically can't find one of these without one of those in there. I've got like, I don't know, 10 of these T1 cards. But I don't have one of these serial connections. This is what was called a, I guess you would call it a high-speed serial interconnect. As I start going over these interface cards, you see I'm going to pull out a bunch of gear and keep talking about T1. So I figured I'd tell you what it is. T1 is a dedicated digital line from the telco provider. I think it was invented by Bell Labs for the Bell system back in the 1960s. It's capable of operating at 1.5 megabits per second, and it can be divided into what are called channels. They can either be data or voice, 24 of them, at least here in the US. I think it's a little different in Europe. I think it's called E1. I don't know, I'm not a European. It's very similar though. So basically you can use T1 to carry 24 phone calls, 24 voice phone calls, or, you know, half of it could be dedicated to data, half of it could be dedicated to phone calls, or just all data. And in most cases, that meant a connection over to the internet. If you grew up in the time when the internet was really taking off, like I did, T1 sort of has this mythical status. It was the first high-speed internet I had ever interacted with. a whopping 1.5 megabits per second. But that's what we're talking about here. T1 was a very common inter-office, across the city, across the state, what type of situation, for having a branch office, a local branch of a bank or something in a small town, and then over to headquarters where they've got all their actual compute infrastructure and everything. That's why on this older stuff you see a lot of these serial connections and these T1 CSU DSUs, very common back then in the 90s and into the 2000s as a way to connect disparate locations. And one final note, T1 operates over copper pairs. This is a T1 cable right here. There's only 4 wires in there, hence the Bell system origins. They were dealing with this constraint. They wanted to figure out how to cram voice channels and data into the existing telephone system. Now, the story with this serial connection here is that it was probably also used for T1 as well, just like this dedicated T1 DSU CSU. So I've got this ADTRAN TSU. Basically, you'd need additional equipment, and they had these awesome cables, really hefty, thick cables. This is a V25 connector, and it's got these massive pins on there. That's pretty typical for this T1 equipment. And then, of course, you go like this, and you got a leased line, a T1 line coming in from your telco provider, and you would have like a branch office over here, and somewhere else you'd have your main headquarters. I've actually got plenty of videos where I hooked up this exact setup, but I didn't have one of these serial connectors in the WIC form, I don't think. I do have some of these older Cisco 1600 series. I think these are late 90s as well, and they've actually got the serial port just built right in. Now here's a question I've always had. Did anyone just directly interconnect routers like this? I suppose you'd need some sort of crossover cable, but was that a legit setup to use these for something other than something like T1? So like interconnecting gear in the same rack? I think it's technically possible if I found the right cabling. But yeah, if you did this back in the day, is that something people did? These serial connections could support 2 megabit per second at their max synchronous speed. And I think you could also hook up like analog modems. I don't think it necessarily had to be T1. Got us all hooked up here. You interact with these Cisco units over a console port. It's just a serial connection that goes over an RJ45 cable. I've got this into a USB to serial converter, and then we've got power, of course. So let's fire it on, and we'll go take a look at ROMmon. It's fired up, and here's ROMmon. So basically, if you don't know a lot about the Cisco stuff, this is like a home labber's worst nightmare. You get this thing off of eBay, you've watched all these tutorials about iOS and how to set up your Cisco stuff, and you're just stuck at this weird thing called ROMmon. So this is like the firmware of the router. You can break into this on purpose when the router's booting up, and you can do things like reset a password, stuff like that. I'll do a video on that someday. I can't type anymore. I'm going to restart my session here. That was weird. Don't know what that was about. So you can type help, and we have some options in here to interact with the machine. The first thing I do if I'm troubleshooting an issue trying to boot into the operating system is you can do dev. This will show you all the devices that can store data or files on the machine. And you can see here we've got one device, the internal flash. It's called flash : and then you can look inside there. So we can say dir flash : and there's nothing. We have it, well, that's not true. There is a backup config file for iOS. No version of iOS, you would see this big, long file name with a .bin usually. So what this means is it is time for yet another iOS tutorial. So you already saw, we can say dev for device, see all the devices that could be storing a Cisco iOS image, and then of course we can dir the device name to see what's on there. If we do help, or you can also do question mark, just like in normal iOS, as you'll see. Lots of other stuff. We want to look at set. Set is going to show you all the variables that exist. They're kind of like, you can think of these like environment variables.